Hello, folks, and welcome to another SACPA session. SACPA is very thankful for the continuing support we receive from the University of Lethbridge, Show Spotlight, and the Lethbridge Herald. SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the lands of the Blackfoot people and Métis nations of Alberta, Region 3, and we pay respect to their past, present, and future cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. SACPA is committed to assist reconciliation efforts by raising awareness of the ways past and present injustices can be reconciled. Today we'd like to introduce you to Mark Holzer from the Canadian Red Cross. Mark, thank you very much for joining at such late notice. We had a little bit of an emergency with our previous speaker, and so we're very thankful that you've joined us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Mark began his career in emergency management with the American Red Cross prior to returning to Canada and joining the Canadian Red Cross in 2018. While in the US, Mark supported many local responses in southwestern Pennsylvania, as well as Hurricane Sandy and the Haiti earthquake. Now based in Edmonton, Mark supports the Alberta Emergency Management team to plan and prepare for all hazards. Everything from single-family house fires to community-wide impact fire and flooding events. Once again, thanks for joining us at such short notice, and we very much look forward to your presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Annalise. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here and speak to your viewers and share some information about the organization, the Canadian Red Cross, and the work that we do here, both in Alberta and the Northwest Territories, but across Canada and internationally as well. So we do have a presentation, and right off the bat, as we mentioned, unfortunately, Jen McManus was unable to join us. She is disappointed. She does like these opportunities to connect with our communities. She is our provincial vice president and would be more than happy to rejoin at another later date if the opportunity was to arise as well. But I have agreed to step in and join you, which I'm happy to do. And if we do come up anything on the presentation that sparks any questions that unfortunately I might be unable to answer, we'll be happy to try and get that answer for you at a later date as well. Also on the next slide, so Annalise had provided a land acknowledgement for us, but I would also like to, as I am based in Edmonton, Alberta as well. So I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I am located in Region 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and many others whose histories and languages, cultures, continue to influence our vibrant community. So to begin, on the next slide, we're just going to review some of the Canadian Red Cross's history, as well as what guides the work that we do. And then we'll continue on to refer to some of the specific programs and services that we offer, the work that we've been doing over the pandemic, even before that, and how we've had to adapt and change our methodologies as a result of the pandemic and all that includes. So the Canadian Red Cross has been active in Canada since 1896 and officially became the Canadian Red Cross in 1909 through an act of Parliament. Our mission is help people and communities throughout Canada and the world in times of need and to support them, strengthening their resiliency. Today, we're the largest humanitarian organization in the world. The photo in the presentation has three emblems. On the left, you'll notice the Red Cross, which is synonymous with many of the Red Crosses that operate throughout countries, but it's also recognized through different symbols in some other countries as well. On the next slide, we have our guiding principles, our fundamental principles. These shape how we approach the work that we do through humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, and universality. We hold these very near and dear to everything that we do and the approach that we take so that we're able to provide the proper support to all communities and all people within those communities, regardless of geographic boundaries. On the next slide, our beginnings, really did start in the early 1900s, being active in Alberta since 1907, working locally on a range of programs and services that we continue to adapt to people's changing needs. And our mission, guided by our fundamental principles, are also supported through our pillars in emergencies and health and areas of expertise such as direct assistance, volunteerism, building capacity, and strengthening our communities based on research, training, and education. This also cannot be accomplished without philanthropy and influencing humanitarian action across the world. In Alberta, the Red Cross has recruited, trained, and engaged more than 13,000 volunteers across all lines of service, not just in emergency management, as well as providing staff, offices throughout the province, and services available to all communities in both Alberta and Northwest Territories. So our geography that we're responsible for doesn't end with just the provincial boundaries of Alberta, but also up into the Northwest Territories as well. And in addition, we also provide a lot of support to our neighboring provinces as they're dealing with some of the responses that they're working through. As you might have heard, in Manitoba, they're dealing with some significant flooding as well, which is happens every year, but sometimes local capacity is exceeded, and so other provinces provide support and assistance as necessary as well. So after a little bit of history, so on the next slide, we will be looking at the work that we are doing in Canada and around the world. So I encourage you to think about some of the events that you might be familiar with, and if you do have any questions regarding those, please don't hesitate to ask at the question answer period following. So the main lines of service or programs that we offer is emergency management, which is one of the larger programs, having the significant volunteer population as well that we utilize to be able to do all of the work that we do. We're a volunteer-led organization where we engage many, many volunteers to help us be able to respond to all of the needs of the communities as well. This is focusing on the cycle of emergency management, which is planning and preparedness for the ability to respond and provide support to those communities, as well as looking into the long-term recovery operations that are necessary for communities to return to their pre-disaster state as well. In addition to emergency management, where we are focusing on that planning for the response side of things, we've also begun developing a disaster preparedness and risk reduction program where it's supporting communities to identify ways that they can make themselves more prepared, more resilient. So in the event that something was to happen, a community fire or flood, then the road to recovery is hopefully a little bit easier for folks as well. Separate from emergency management, but also incredibly important, are our community health and wellness programs. A big component of that is our health equipment and loan program, or HELP. Throughout the province, we have a number of HELP depots, and HELP, I refer to that as the acronym of Health Equipment and Loan Program, where people in the community are able to come to our offices and borrow health equipment, walkers, wheelchairs, assistive aids for the bathroom, and those kinds of things as well. Not necessarily, hopefully, items that someone might need long term, but they're able to access those for that short term where they might need that assistance. And also looking at supporting communities through prevention and safety, through our first aid training, and our opioid harm reduction programs that we're reaching into as well, which I'll be speaking to a little bit more in depth upcoming as well. And finally, there's the international operations. So the Red Cross that operates in different countries may have different lines of services than what the Canadian Red Cross offers, but a lot of them are similar, and we support other countries as well by deploying resources, both workforce as well as materials as needed. So we want to make sure that the Canadian Red Cross is able to support other societies around the world in their times of need as well. So as I mentioned, we'd like to look at these programs and lines of services in a little bit more depth. So we'll begin with emergency management. So on the next slide, the big piece is responding every 3 hours in Canada. And you might ask yourself, there's not big events every 3 hours in Canada, and that is true. But one of our programs that we do offer is through our Personal Disaster Assistance Program. And this is a service that is available to anyone and everyone who has a personal disaster, such as a house fire, maybe a small flood in their home, apartment buildings that maybe need to be evacuated, or whatnot. So small, localized, individual events where we're able to provide immediate emergency temporary assistance to get folks somewhere safe and provide that immediate assistance of food, clothing, lodging as well. And unfortunately, that does happen every 3 hours throughout the country. But through our trained volunteers, we're able to respond to those events, meet with the families, provide them that direct financial assistance, but also the soft assistance, the listening ear, the comfort, a blanket, just to be able to provide them, with that little bit of guidance of there's some support immediately for them, providing them that direction of what to do next, and make sure that they have a safe place to go following their house fire or something like that as well. Thankfully, the big events, they don't happen very often. Unfortunately, we are seeing large events happening more often and becoming more severe. But as we can work with communities on their planning and hopefully making them more resilient to lessen the impact as well. And so through that disaster preparedness and risk reduction program that we do offer, is that we're able to provide some of that knowledge to communities, both individually as homeowners or whatnot, but also communities that can address, if something was to happen, how can the Red Cross support, but also what can the community do themselves to be able to be a little bit better prepared as well. In 2020-2021, the Red Cross has helped more than 1,200 Albertans through this the Personal Disaster Assistance Program. and across the country, more than 33,000 people as well. So even just on the small events, fairly significant impact within the province, but also across the country as well. And unfortunately, with the big events, we're talking much higher numbers as well. As you may recall from the Alberta wildfires in 2016 in the Fort McMurray, Wolf Buffalo area, having more than 80,000 people evacuated, and still going through recovery 6 years later as well. And that's just one of the most recent events. If you look back to 2013 and the Southern Alberta floods, or 2011, the Slave Lake wildfires, and even more recently, the Fort McMurray floods in 2020, which saw another 14,000 people displaced as well. So these are significant events, and there's that range between single-family house fires up to the Fort McMurray size events and everything in between. Currently, there's some flooding happening in the Northwest Territories and Northwest Alberta that have impacted several thousands of people as well, and the Red Cross is happy to provide support as necessary for these communities as well. Okay. On the next slide, talks a little bit more about the Fort McMurray floods. So this was a very unique response for us because it was the first large response during the pandemic. So typically the Red Cross likes to be in community with our volunteers, working with people who are evacuated as well. But with the complications of COVID-19, we were needing to focus on the health and safety of everyone, both our own workforce, but the community at large. So it did result in us needing to adjust how we would approach providing support and assistance. And then so we did shift to a little bit of a virtual model to be able to support these 13,000 people who were evacuated as well. Another unique and interesting thing about this event is that a significant number of these people were also impacted by the 2016 wildfires. So in addition to now they're dealing with a flood event, they're still in their recovery following the wildfires, and all of the factors that come into that. Even though you may rebuild your house, there's still the memory and the trauma of these events as well, and now being dual impacted by a significant flood event as well. And psychological first aid is a key component within emergency management, which I'll speak to a little bit later as well, and goes back to that component of not only providing direct financial assistance or blankets or things like that, but just the additional psycho-emotional support that's so critical for these as well. So as on the next slide, we're starting to shift a little bit from emergency management in terms of people having an event and us being able to provide some assistance, but how do we do that in a pandemic? The Red Cross is not an organization that wants to not be there. We want to be in every community that is in need and requests us. And so how do we do that in a pandemic? Everyone has well acquainted with all of the restrictions and changes that we've had to make in our personal lives as a result of the pandemic. And a big piece of that was keeping ourselves, keeping our neighbors safe. And so how do we adjust being able to provide that support to communities in a pandemic? And one of those ways was to shift to doing things a little bit more virtual. Everyone has gotten very accustomed to Skype and Zoom and all of that, but it goes beyond that as well, because you can't connect with people in a meaningful way as well through a screen. So while that was a component to it, we had also really adapted to be able to focus on that health and safety aspect of responses and being in communities. So we were looking at ways to make sure that we were implementing policies and procedure to keep people safe, ensuring, good physical distancing, proper use of PPE at appropriate levels based on the situation as well, but also looking at ways to support communities as they are dealing with the pandemic. So one of those examples is when things were first starting way back, can't believe it's been 2.5 years, and people were returning to Canada and landing in Ontario at CFB Trenton, and so being welcomed and having to do the whole isolation thing and whatnot, and so the Red Cross was there supporting people who were returning as well. So shifting a little bit from disaster response to the pandemic response as well. As the pandemic went on, we were looking at ways to continue to support communities. There was the isolation of seniors in large cities, food insecurity for vulnerable populations, lack of medical facilities in Indigenous communities, and supporting patient overflow in hospitals as well. So in the early days of all of this is providing some financial support, but also just the guidance and expertise as we began developing COVID protocols and whatnot as well. Okay, so that was just sort of the general approach. On the next slide, looking at more local work that we've done. So for almost the entire pandemic, we have been working with the PHAC, or the Public Health Agency of Canada, supporting travelers returning to Canada, as well as providing COVID-19 testing at border entry sites, working with Correction Services Canada for epidemic prevention and control at federal correctional facilities as well, and launching a friendly calls program. So as I had mentioned, people feeling a lot more vulnerable and isolated as a result of this, and so being able to provide that support through phone calls and just checking in with people and whatnot, and making sure that we're trying to minimize the impacts, again, sort of the health and mental health of folks during the pandemic as well. On the next slide, this is just the last piece, sort of COVID specific, it was a very interesting opportunity for us in the province, is that we had our emergency response unit, or ERU, deployed domestically. And so what that is basically a field hospital that we're able to deploy. And until the pandemic, we had not deployed this domestically. It was always provided to operations overseas, and we were able to deploy that to a few sites in Canada, one being in Edmonton, Alberta, and you may have heard this in the media. So we had set up at the U of A Butterdome. I forget the exact number of tents that we had put up. I think it was about 12, and it was able to be overflow for hospitals, the U of A hospital, should it be necessary. Luckily, it was not activated. We didn't have to reach that point under the strain of healthcare services as well. So again, another interesting footnote in history as a result of the pandemic, unfortunately, and I think everyone's ready to move on and forget about that. But it's good to know where we came from and learn from all of this as well. So as I mentioned, a number of services and programs that we offer go beyond just emergency management and disaster response. And that might be sort of the big one because it's oftentimes sort of the forefront that people know what the Red Cross does. But we don't want to forget about all of the other good work that the rest of the organization is doing. So on the next slide, we're talking about our community health and wellness programs. So as I mentioned, our HELP program, which is the health equipment loan program, which is fairly straightforward. Anybody who is in need of that assistance is able to access our HELP depots across the province for that. And then also within that is our wellness check-in and for seniors, as well as the Friendly Call program as well. So in Alberta for the last year, we've assisted more than 22,000 people and loaned out more than 42,000 pieces of equipment. And this is all done through our volunteers who meet and greet people at our depots, get them the equipment that they need, and then when it's returned, do a quick service, make sure it's in good working order to be reissued again. So again, 22,000 people in a year, pretty significant need that's there as well. After our community health and wellness, through that, we're taking that one step further through our first aid and opioid harm reduction programs. So first aid, I'm sure everybody is familiar with. We are able to provide first aid certification throughout the province for that. And taking that even one step further is participating in a Canada Health initiative aimed at reducing opioid-related deaths by increasing Canadians' access to opioid poisoning response training and life-saving medication, so naloxone kits, for example, and how to properly use them, but also providing people with the knowledge so that should they come across somebody who's experiencing opioid poisoning, that they're able to intervene and provide that life-saving support as needed. So a primary focus that we're looking at is the underserved or remote communities throughout Alberta and working with them and making sure that we're connecting with as many people who work with that population as possible. And in addition to first aid, I mentioned the psychological first aid as well. So this is another service that we offer for folks to be able to help folks in crisis as well, not just the physical ailments, but also the emotional and mental health aspect as well. Okay, and then finally, touching just briefly on how the Canadian Red Cross supports international operations. So on the next slide, we are focusing on the events that happen throughout the world, impacting all communities, and the Red Cross oftentimes will provide that support, as I mentioned, either with our workforce and deploying Canadians internationally or through just materials as needed. So in the last year, the Red Cross has reached more than 2.5 million people internationally through our programming and partnerships with other national societies. And that's through 93 humanitarian missions to 25 different countries as well. So that's talking about what we do domestically in other countries, but as we all know, there are events that happen in other countries that can impact Canada in a variety of ways, and how we might support that locally as well. Most notably on the next slide, we're talking about the arrivals from Ukraine following the Ukraine crisis, where we've been seeing a number of Ukraine nationals coming to Canada, and so through IRCC, the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada partnership, that we've been set up at a number of hotels across the country, Edmonton, Toronto, and Vancouver, welcoming people and connecting them with appropriate resources and referrals as they're coming in. So even though this is, an international event, we're still planning and preparing for these types of situations as well. And the Ukraine crisis is not unique, having provided support, for example, to Syrians as well previously as well. Okay, and I think we're almost about at the end of the presentation, which is good timing because we're about there as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I've put up the last slide with your website on how to learn more, volunteer, or donate. Thank you so much, Mark, for your presentation. That was very informative. I just have a question for you. As you were talking about sort of the increase of natural disasters, do you have and with climate change changing, does the Red Cross actually have a contingency plan to think about how this would, how the increase of that would affect the Red Cross?
So we do, and it is something that we pay very close attention to. So as part of our planning and preparedness is that we partner with communities to get a better understanding of what are their risks and hazards, what are they seeing locally that might increase the likelihood, but also severity of these events, and how do we work with these communities to properly prepare for the requests or support that might come in. So if we're looking at sort of the traditional quote unquote emergency management preparedness, is making sure that we are training enough volunteers to be able to respond to those events, having good communication with partners and communities to know what the extent of risk might be as well, and just being able to respond to those, realizing that we can't predict what's going to happen when and where, but how can we best be prepared for that? This is side by side with disaster risk reduction, where providing information to communities to, provide information on what can they do to be better prepared themselves as well. Having a personal emergency plan, making sure that you have a preparedness kit. So in the event that you needed to evacuate, you're able to do that quickly and efficiently with everything that you would have as well. And then just continuing to monitor weather patterns and things like that.
Okay. Our next question comes from Laura Schultz. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. Would you comment on the post-disaster work the Red Cross does with communities?
Yeah, certainly. So as with everything that the Red Cross does, we try to have these partnerships with communities so that we can understand how they can best be supported, identifying gaps. So for local communities approach, if they have to evacuate, working with local authorities to be able to provide that support either during a evacuation, but then also for flood, for example, waters come up, people are evacuated, the water goes down, and then what? So having conversations with the local authorities on what does that reentry to community look like, what are the needs for recovery as well, and part of that conversation is looking at just the support and expertise. Does that also include financial assistance and whatnot? And so it depends on funds raised for events and those kinds of things as well. So, unfortunately, there isn't just a cut and dry in every situation, this is what's going to happen and how it happens. It's all based on the events and figuring out, what are the needs and resources that are available to help meet those needs.
Our next question comes from Mark Goodall. Do we have any Canadian volunteers currently on the ground in the Ukraine or the surrounding countries taking part in the crisis there, i.e. Poland, Hungary, etc.?
Unfortunately, my answer will be fairly brief. We do. I just don't have specifics at this time. Exactly who like how many people have been deployed and where they are and the work that they're doing as well. But we have deployed folks. Yes.
Our next question comes from Henning Mundell. Does the International Red Cross still deal with blood donations and distribution, realizing the Canadian Red Cross no longer does?
So individual societies in countries do. As I had mentioned, there are different lines of service in different countries based on those organizations. So some European countries, for example, have actually a much more active healthcare role in some of those as well. And yeah, so Canadian Blood Services has taken that on as well, but a number of countries do still have that program.
Laura Schultz, how does the Red Cross mitigate or work around challenges in countries that may not have infrastructure? For example, distributing food/medicine in countries with gangs or corruption.
Mm-hmm. So that is a challenge, absolutely. And I think I'll revert back to our fundamental principles. Is that we will provide the support that we can wherever we can, based on these principles as well, and navigating through maybe some unstable regions can be tricky. There's logistical issues, transportation issues, as well as just the ability to sort of travel freely through that. Luckily, the Red Cross and Red Crescent is a internationally recognized symbol of assistance, and that does provide a little bit of ability to do the work that we do as well. But it is working with those local authorities to be able to safely carry out the work that we do as well, and just making sure that we're navigating through supply chain issues or something like that as best we can. Depending on the situation in a country or a region, there might not be sort of any good option, and so it's looking at what is the best option that will deliver the aid and support, but also keeping people safe as well.
The next question comes from Bev Mundell, and I think you talked about it in your PowerPoint presentation, but I'll ask it anyway. Is the Canadian Red Cross involved in Canada's opioid crisis, and if so, how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's through that awareness and education support. So very similar to first aid training, psychological first aid training is providing that awareness of what is the opioid crisis, who does it impact, how does it impact people, are in what communities and whatnot, but then taking that next step of training people how to respond to somebody who is experiencing an opioid poisoning as well. So being able to be confident in some training that you would receive to directly intervene. And again, this is to your level of comfort and training. But even if you're not comfortable with administering naloxone, for example, at least taking the steps to properly care for somebody while first responders are being able to be dispatched as well.
Our next question comes from Mark Goodall. Is there a Red Cross organization in Russia?
There is, yes, yeah. And again, back to our fundamental principles, support is being offered. So for this specific crisis, support is being offered to everyone impacted, Ukrainians, Russians, as well as part of that neutrality and independence.
On your last slide, you talked about people being able to volunteer. What would it look like if you were to approach the Canadian Red Cross and say that you wanted to volunteer? What does that entail? How does, would you be sent to a disaster zone, or what?
Yeah, it could be. It's a an application process where you meet with our representatives to determine what would be the best fit for you. What is your interest in volunteering for the Red Cross? Is it emergency management? Is it the help program or friendly calls, or whatnot? The majority of our volunteers are under emergency management, but we have philanthropy volunteers that help raise funds. So it's just meeting with our representatives that do the onboarding of volunteers, identifying what that best role would be for you, and then helping you navigate through that path. So for example, emergency management, I want to help people following those house fires, be one of those every 3 hours volunteers. Not that busy in Alberta, thankfully. That's across the country, but you are brought on as a volunteer. You receive pretty extensive training on how to complete all of the paperwork and work with individuals following a disaster, and then you're connected with our local coordinators and being able to get the training and then experience. We have some volunteers who support the single family house fires, but we have other volunteers who have the ability to deploy, and so they're sent throughout the province, up into the Northwest Territories, into BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Atlantic provinces as well. So it's based on your interest, your comfortability, your availability, and ability to go outside of your community. So if you were to volunteer with us, you don't have to leave your community, but the opportunity is there if you so interest. International is a little bit different based on the skill sets that's needed and whatnot, but really it's up to you how you want to volunteer. That's the beauty of volunteering. You choose.
Wonderful. Next question comes from Laura Schultz. Does the Red Cross collaborate with other agencies such as Doctors Without Borders, etc., pre-disaster or during a disaster?
I will say yes, yes, and yes. Yeah, we do collaborate with a number of different organizations, and it's not, this is the list and this is only the list. It is whoever we need to work with to be able to do this. The Red Cross can't do everything. No organization can. So it's really a collaborative effort among nonprofits, local government, provincial government, federal government, as well, in figuring out, who's bringing what to the table and how do we best coordinate? How do we make the most out of the resources available for that? And so having those conversations ahead of time means that when an event happens, then it is a little bit more smooth into transition to actually doing the work that's there. So yeah, so it's all of those different organizations and having those conversations ahead of time, as well as being able to work together based on whatever kind of event is happening.
Mark Goodall, do you accept donations of used medical aids such as walkers, crutches, etc.?
That I do not know. I do apologize. That specific question. I know that the Help Depot does. But if you were to look on our website, I'm sure you could find that answer. But I'm also happy to try and track that down, and Annalisa can send that to you if you like.
Okay, that was everything from. Oh, Laura Schultz, sorry. Would you elaborate on the training for international response volunteers, i.e., types of skills, etc.?
I don't have a ton that I can share, as I'm not terribly familiar with that piece. But if you were to go to our website, that would provide some additional information for it, and oftentimes it depends on the need of the specific operation as well. Is it something that you've had experience dealing with those kinds of events previously in a professional capacity or something like that? Maybe you have a background in logistics or supply chain management, that kind of a thing, or is it a health care background, something that you would bring as well. So it really depends on the specific needs of operations and the roles that are needed at the time as well. And what are the needs of the local Red Cross in that country, right? So do they have some gaps of maybe some specialized roles that they're looking for as well, or is it such a big event that they're just needing more bodies as well, and that would dictate that as well. Yeah.
Next question from Laura Schultz. Was the Red Cross involved in the recent and ongoing crisis in Afghanistan?
I do apologize. I don't have information on that.
Mark Goodall, do you receive any government funding? Canada matches donations towards the Ukrainian crisis, but they contribute regularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so not specifically funding per se, but it is dependent on, if we are contracting with, so for example, for the quarantine sites during the pandemic and whatnot, so that there is some funding available to the Red Cross to help us operate for that. The funds that we raise for an event are dedicated to that event. So if you, for example, in this grocery store and they're raising funds for the BC wildfires, even though it's in Alberta, that funds generated go to that event as well.
Okay. Thanks so much, Mark. Those were the questions in our queue today. Before we wrap up this session, do you have a take-home message for our viewers, please?
Yeah, I would say, related to our last slide is that if there's any of this that is interesting to you, consider to volunteer with us. As I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities, not just in emergency management, but local in other areas throughout the province or other provinces as well. But in addition to helping the Red Cross be prepared through having volunteers, take steps to prepare yourself and your family. As I mentioned, communities that are better prepared are more resilient, and the recovery is a little bit easier when communities and individuals are properly prepared as well. If you have your 3-day emergency kit that you can evacuate with, then that's great. So just what can you do personally to prepare yourself and your family?
Thank you, and on behalf of SACPA, thank you for an informative presentation, and SACPA is very grateful for your availability to present at the last minute. So thanks very much. And
Very welcome.
for our viewers, we hope you join us next week with Mahdi and Jenna Al-Tahari, the difficult journey out of Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. So I hope you join us then, and we'll end the live stream.